Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sally Thurston from the Maynard Public Library, and we are so happy to have Jane Oneail with us tonight. She's going to talk about glass artists, and this is going to be fabulous. I'm so excited. Just a few things. We're in webinar mode tonight, and we're going to be using the Q&A for questions. Um, so you can ask them as we go along, but Jane will get to them at the end of her presentation. So if something occurs to you, put it in and she can back up her slides and get to the right place to answer your question. Um, as always, I want to thank our friends group. They sponsored this program as well as so many things that we do, including Maynard is having its 10th book festival starting middle of next week, so April 7th through April 11th. So if you're in the Maynard area, we'd love to have you. Um, we'd love to see you at the festival. And I'm going to introduce Jane now. Jane Oneail leads Culturally Curious and presents art appreciation programs throughout New England. She holds a master's degree in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. She's worked at some of New England's most esteemed cultural institutions. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about art glass. I had so much fun putting this program together. And let me tell you, we're going to have a blast looking at these images. We think of glass as being so fragile and delicate, and we are going to see it do extraordinary things over the course of the next hour. So we are going to be looking at breathtakingly beautiful works, boundary breaking works. We're going to try and summarize the history of art glass, but we're focusing primarily on American traditions here from the past 130 so years. So we'll be getting back to this gorgeous image on the screen along the way, but let's get started with our program overview. This first section with just a nice flashy name is really just going to be our quick introduction and overview in terms of glass as an artistic medium, and it's going to be very brief. And then we'll turn our attention to Louis Comfort Tiffany and Tiffany Studios. This is an example of their artistic output, this gorgeous stained glass window. So we'll take a look at works like this and others. And then as we move into the 20th century, we're going to be thinking about modernism and how that was translated through Steuben glassworks and ultimately Corning glassworks as well. Now, all of this represents a particular tradition where designer and creator were pretty distinct from each other. And we see that shifting by the time we get to the studio glass revolution, really. It's not even a movement. And so we'll see a couple of key figures there that open the doors for our rock star tonight, Dale Chihuly. And then we'll wrap up with a quick peek at one of Chihuly's students, who is from New Hampshire, and another one I think, these great representatives of that studio glass movement, Josh Simpson. Okay, lots to cover here. I have way more slides than normal, but I mean, the work is just so beautiful. So let's get started with our very quick history here. So of course, when we're thinking about glass, we're thinking about putting essentially sand, silica, and a couple of other materials together into a furnace to heat it up. And this whole tradition of making glass this way goes back thousands of years, roughly dates to about 1500 BCE. And those traditions really started in ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, when basically human beings discovered that you could basically mold molten glass, usually around like a clay or dung mold. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at this little vessel that might have been used for something like perfume, and it was made in ancient Egypt. I mean, just their ability to create this shape, to modify the colors here as well, is pretty astonishing. And something like this would have been a luxury item. And today, of course, it's in the Corning Museum of Glass. Now, if we skip forward a couple thousands of years, we're in ancient Rome at this point, and this is really where we see the beginnings of glass blowing. And we have an artist's sort of imagining of what an ancient Roman glass blowing studio would have looked like. And actually, a lot of these practices are still used today. We oftentimes see glass blowers using this kind of long pipe and using that molten glass at the end to expand the form. Now, because glass blowing became sort of prolific during this time, you see jars, bottles, all sorts of different vessels, and glass blowing studios essentially are industries all over the Roman Empire. But we also see that there is an ability to make extravagant and really delicate work, like this image that we have over here on the right. This is called a diatetra, or a cage cup, and believe it or not, this sort of loose lattice work that surrounds the vessel itself is all carved out here. It's just amazing to even imagine trying to make something like this. Now, we're going to move forward about another 1,000 years too. I said this was going to be our quick history. And now we're considering stained glass window making in the French Gothic tradition. And of course, when we're thinking about those traditions, this is an era where essentially walls dissolve. Walls become like skeletons so that they can give way to these beautiful saturated colors from the stained glass windows. This is Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, which dates to the mid 1200s. And we see the gorgeous cobalt blue, the ruby red here, and it's all it's all very sophisticatedly rendered in the service of biblical storytelling, really. So here we see glass sort of merging with the aspiration to make it divine, to make the light coming through that glass divine. So it has a pretty important purpose here. But one of the most important places in Europe when it comes to glass making traditions is in Italy. And we are looking at the Venetian Lagoon here on the screen. Here's Venice, there's the Grand Canal, and we can see on the image just above it is this island called Murano. And Murano is really the hub of glassmaking in the world, really, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's clustered there for a couple of reasons, primarily because there was a lot of wooden structures in Venice. And so they wanted to get all of the furnaces and all of that heat away from the wood to protect where people lived. So they clustered it away on this other island. And then it became a way to keep the secrets of Venetian glassblowing private, so that people couldn't leave and share the remarkable sort of cultivated talent and wisdom that was there in Murano. And actually, it became, if you did share those secrets, it was a crime punishable by death. What we're looking at over here in the image on the right is the Doge of Venice coming to visit the Murano glassblowing factories, because, of course, like the head of state here has that vested interest in the glass production. So Murano becomes known for a number of things. They become known for these sort of striped vessels here, which are known as filigrana, and it's this kind of threaded cane work, but it becomes kind of their signature element. Those are examples from the Corning Glass Museum. This central image here, which just looks like a ceramic plate, right? This is actually glass too, and it's this famous Murano milk glass known as Latimo. And then over here on the far right, I think most people think of Murano and they think of this clarity in their crystal. They're also very well known for making mirrors, and both the plate here and the glass date back hundreds of years. So we really are talking about an extraordinary capacity so early on in modern history. Now, what happens when America takes a stab at glass blow and glass making? Well, we're very industrious here, and we're not as concerned with like the rarefied object. So we see the Boston and Sandwich Glass Company really taking off the beginning of the 19th century, and this is pressed glass. So essentially you can like put it in a form, press it, mass produce it. And they specialized in kind of these fancy patterns, lacy patterns like this. But these sorts of objects, and this one's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, became staples in sort of upper class homes in the 19th century in America. You can sort of think of it as like the democratization of glass. Everybody gets some in America. Now, one of the sort of rivals of the Boston and Sandwich Glass Company was the New England Glass Company that was founded in Cambridge in 1818. And they were like the other dominant form of force in glass in America. And they were known for more of like their elegant shapes here. We have the little pitcher and the receptacle here for sugar, and there's some applied ornamentation there. The lamp over here on the right is also in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we can see that they're kind of copying European models here, and there's a certain refinement to it as well that's really quite impressive. So American glass has come a long way in a short time, and they really are in so many ways producing work by the 19th century that is in dialogue with what's being produced in Europe. It's rivaling the imports, really. One of the, I think, the more fanciful elements of American glass that was being produced by these big companies that I just mentioned was the paperweights. This was like its own little cottage industry within the glass industry. And this was a great way for glass blowers to showcase their skills. And we can see a couple of different styles and approaches here. This style here, where we can see like the ends of the like these cut rods that look like little flowers here. This is the millefiori, like thousand flower style here. And then we think of something like this as being, you know, small enough to sit on your desk, but it demanded this extraordinary precision and technical capability. And these sorts of objects really do remain like very collectible items in American decorative arts. And just to look closely at one, the way something like this was achieved essentially is you'd do this lamp work. You'd make the fruit essentially using a torch, and you're kind of working to create those specific shapes. And the lamp work was done with certain kind of glass that that melts at a much higher level than the glass that then you would then use to encase it. All of this is resting on this really delicate and very complicated lattice work underneath too. So this work was intimate, it was contemplative, it was like a little world that you could just hold in the palm of your hand. And what we're going to see is a move entirely away from this. We are going to move to Louis Comfort Tiffany, who is thinking about glass on an entirely different scale and an entirely different relationship with the viewer. All right, so here we can see him, a photograph and a painting of Louis Comfort Tiffany. He was born in 1848, and it was his father who founded Tiffany and Co. So he's already born into a family that's sort of able to position him for success in whatever realm he might desire, right? And Louis Comfort Tiffany sort of chased a number of different passions throughout his career. He was a painter, he was a decorator, of course, he's a glassmaker as well. We can see him here sitting at his painter's palette. But I want to share with you very quickly his foray into decorating, because he worked as an interior designer in the early 1880s. And get this, you'll never believe what we're looking at. We talk so much about redecorating the White House these days. Well, he was hired by President Chester Arthur to redecorate the White House back in the early 1880s. Actually, apparently, Chester Arthur was known as Elegant Arthur. He had to have the whole White House redone. He hired Tiffany to do it. We have this beautiful stained glass screen that was installed, and you might be thinking, oh my goodness, why haven't I seen this before? Because Teddy Roosevelt tore it all out when he became president. And it should be mentioned too that none of this was really in keeping with the actual style of the White House. So it sort of makes sense that it's gone. I don't believe any of it was preserved as far as I know, but the watercolor pictures, or the paintings, I should say, are preserved in the White House collection. From there, Tiffany, well, actually, just prior to the White House, Tiffany also worked on the Mark Twain House in Hartford, Connecticut, which, if you haven't been before, I highly, highly recommend. It's like this beautiful Victorian house with a preserved interior. And this gives you a sense in terms of Louis Comfort Tiffany's perspective in terms of design. This view into like this little solarium over here, I think, is almost like a precursor to what we'll see with some of his stained glass work as we move right along. So he's working as a decorator, and then he shifts gears. He ultimately chooses to pursue this interest in art glass, and he's working in this field for several years before he opens up his company, Tiffany Glass Company. It sort of later morphs into Tiffany Studios, but this is right around the middle of the 1880s. And it's at a time, especially going into the 1890s or so, where this style of Art Nouveau is just like like wildfire all over Europe and in the United States too. So we see these kind of elegant, organic vessels here that are inspired by nature, that have this sort of sinuous line here to them as well. And I mean, they're just gorgeous to behold, aren't they? Now, it's Louis Comfort Tiffany who coined the term Favre glass. And he borrowed this from an old English word that essentially meant handcrafted, but he used this word to essentially speak to the iridescent surface on so many of the objects, the glass objects that he produced. And just in case you're wondering, you're thinking, wow, did this man really redesign the White House and then start producing glass like this? For works like this, he was the designer, and then there were craftsmen who were doing the glass work itself. So there was a strict division of labor there. And speaking of that division of labor, there were a number of women who were doing the work at Tiffany Studios who really only in recent years have become recognized and celebrated for their contributions. So what we're looking at Clara Driscoll here, and she led the women's glass cutting department for decades for Tiffany Studios, and she was essentially like essential to his business. She was actually one of the highest paid women in the country because of the work that she was doing. So she was indispensable essentially to this whole process. And that's kind of extraordinary when you think that, you know, women in general in the 19th century really couldn't get a foothold in the arts, so to speak. And here she is running this whole division. Of course, she didn't get any credit for her work, really, along with all of the other designers and the craftsmen. They were just sort of absorbed into this notion of what was Tiffany Studios. We can see this gorgeous example of her work over here, the dragonfly lamp. We'll kind of zoom in on this just so you can see, again, that suggestion of that fluttering color that you see in something like the wing of an insect, being so perfectly captured here. And so somebody like Clara Driscoll would have been selecting every single color, laying out this pattern, making all of these decisions, and then somebody else would have been executing it. So she's now really being celebrated for the different lamps that in many cases, well, in some cases we know that she did, and in many cases we can sort of extrapolate. There are no great records. We have some of her letters that say, yes, like, oh yes, my peacock lamp, or oh yes, my peony lamp. So again, we can see those familiar Tiffany forms, the interest in a peacock feather coming to fruition in Claire Driscoll's hands over here, but especially, oh, the painterly quality of these peonies over here and the lamp on the right is just gorgeous. I mean, we're getting almost closer to botanical illustration over here. It's just breathtaking. But the one of the most famous works produced by Tiffany Studios is this lamp here. It's magnificent. There are versions of this lamp in so many museum collections. This is the wisteria lamp that was produced between 1902 and 1910. And we have like these just cascading clusters of the purple petals and then the green leaves here and the vine sort of coming down. It's so romantic, right? And again, it was Clara Driscoll who was thinking of every single shade of purple here and imagining the shape that it could be cut. And there are thousands of pieces here as well. I mean, what a talent to even conceive of something like this. And she was not alone. There were other women doing incredible work at Tiffany Studios. This was Agnes Northrop, and I should just mention too. So many of these women that worked there were just known as the Tiffany girls, which is just so dismissive, right? They're little girls. They're not even women. They're not professionals in any way. But here we have Agnes Northrop, and she came to the company in the 1880s. She's got a nice long career there, and she becomes best known for her landscape work and for her botanical work. So you know, on the right here, we have an example of stained glass that was in a mausoleum that was designed in 1908. We don't know for sure if this is Northrop's work, but she essentially created similar compositions throughout her career. So it's a safe bet that it's hers. This is called the River of Life here, and we can see that it's framed by these magnolias at the top of the composition, and then down here by these incredible purple irises. Again, the color choices here are just, and then we think that we remember that this is for a mausoleum setting. And the peacefulness that is suggested in the atmospheric perspective of this landscape and how our eye is drawn down this lazy river, sort of that transition from one world to the next. You don't need a picture of a saint or the Virgin Mary in your stained glass window when a window like this can do all of that emotional lifting. So it's not a surprise that Northrop also designed the Danner Memorial window that we started with. This is from 1913. And again, I mean, the colors here just knock your socks off. That cobalt blue, that's like the Saint Chapelle that we started with. And again, it's that peaceful river that's bringing us from one place on into the next. This is art that really transforms grief into peace, right? This is such a picturesque and lush and luminous landscape. And it's amazing to look at this and think that it wasn't created with like a paint and brushes, particularly as we're looking at that distant sky there. It really is extraordinary. I want to share with you more work from Northrop. These are two memorial windows that came from a church in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Memorial windows in that each one was dedicated to a different person. I believe the one on the left was dedicated to a Civil War veteran, and on the right was to a woman who we don't know that much about. I like to think she was a Claude Monet fan because we've got some water lilies here at the front. So these windows were in that church setting. They were recently purchased by the Allenstown Art Museum in Pennsylvania, which paid something like $1.5 million for these two windows when all was said and done, which was the most they'd ever spent on any acquisition, which shows that Louis Comfort Tiffany's and Tiffany Studio, their artistic output still has this staying power. We still look at it, we're moved by it and by its extraordinary beauty. So I have just a few more examples of this incredible stained glass work that the company was producing. This series of three windows is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is the Thompson Memorial window that dates to 22, if I'm right, or oh, sorry, 1912. It was commissioned by a woman who was a businesswoman, a philanthropist. She was a suffragette. You got to love that. But she had this estate essentially in Pennsylvania, and she wanted a series of windows that would actually evoke the view of the garden that laid beyond them. Why not just get clear glass? But if you can afford an estate, you can afford some beautiful stained glass. Now Northrop's work here is so exquisite over these like 20 feet of stained glass here that Tiffany actually put these on view in like an exhibit in New York City before they eventually went to their final destination. So we can think of this particular commission as being conceived and crafted, really even commissioned almost entirely by women. And it's one of the most significant works to emerge from the studio. I like to think of it as that natural extension of what Tiffany was doing, even when he was designing a space like Mark Twain's house. He was thinking about that relationship between nature and glass and that sort of diffused experience that we can have as the light comes in and transforms our experience in an interior space. So I have just one last magnificent stained glass window. This also can probably be attributed to Northrop as well. This is from 1923, 1924. It's a late major window. It's called Autumn Landscape, and it was actually it's about 11 feet tall. It was designed for a Boston mansion, believe it or not. But for whatever reason, it was never installed. And the year after it was finished, it was actually donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And at this late stage in the game, we can see that Northrop and these other craftsmen for Tiffany are just, I mean, they're at the height of their powers, essentially. We get this dreamlike, evocative landscape, and they're actually using, it's hard to see in a picture like this, but they're actually using like the rippling of the glass, the layering of the glass to evoke things like the foliage and the movement of water here. It's all so beautiful and it's so sophisticated. Now, this is kind of a funny postscript, or an interesting postscript, I should say, because Tiffany was so popular and because he was so successful, he built himself an 84-room mansion on Long Island, and he got to decorate it as he saw fit. So you can almost think of this mansion, Laurelton Hall, as like his self-portrait. Here is his own Tiffany stained glass window that was part of a series of the seasons, the four seasons. Here's spring, that was featured in his mansion. Now, unfortunately, Tiffany passed away in 1933, and a couple of decades later, the mansion burned down. But a few of the elements were saved, preserved, and are now exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So here's his colonnade. It's like the full expression of that Art Nouveau style. The stained glass window right back here is, I think, a favorite for so many when it comes to Louis Comfort Tiffany. This is View of Oyster Bay, and it dates to 1908. And whereas we saw the River of Life mausoleum stained glass windows as having like that transition from one place to the next, now it's like you've arrived, right? This is a place of pleasure. We've got the wisteria, we've got the placid water, we've got this pink sky. It's just all so gorgeous. And you can bet somebody like Louis Comfort Tiffany probably saw something like this and he felt like he had arrived, right? So it is pretty extraordinary to think that virtually all of these things were designed by women. And we're just going to end our look at Tiffany on this thorny subject of attribution. This is a different kind of work here. This is actually a painting by one of America's most famous artists from the first few decades of the 20th century, and that was Maxfield Parrish. And it looks a little different because it's not a stained glass window, it is a mosaic, and it's Tiffany glass mosaic. So it's called The Dream Garden. It dates to 1916. It's an absolutely enormous work of art. I think it's something like almost 60 feet long. It's made up of 100,000 glass tiles, which you can bet were selected and placed by women. But of course, we still give credit to Maxfield Parrish and to Louis Comfort Tiffany. So in the end, we have somebody who's very smart about his branding, somebody that had this incredible anonymous studio workforce, of course, many of them women who did the physical work, and that incredible uh, uh, Tiffany legacies sort of remains. I'm glad that we're finally calling out attention to the people that did so much of that creative work. What we're going to do now is have a brief interlude because glass evolved so much in the early 20th century. We're going to see how that division of labor remains consistent for the next few decades as we're looking at Steuben glass and Corning glass. We're not getting too technical with any of this, but when we think of Steuben, that's a pretty well-known name in the glass world. It was founded in 1903 by Frederick Carter and Thomas Hawks, and it started right in Corning, New York, which is now what we call the Crystal City, right? And they start this company in the long shadow of Louis Comfort Tiffany and Tiffany Studios, and they initially embraced this Art Nouveau style, as we can see. In fact, Carter came up with this idea of Orine glass, which sort of has this iridescent quality, very similar to Tiffany's Faverol glass. In fact, it was so similar that Tiffany actually sued them for essentially like copyright infringement. But what begins what dramatically transforms in over the next few decades is Steuben's approach to glassmaking. They are essentially bought up by Corning Glassworks. And here's a view of the Corning Glass offices and factories in the 1930s. And by the 1930s, we see a whole new approach to making glass. It's informed by the research and the development that's going on at Corning Glassworks. And we also see an artistic movement that's headed towards something that's less to do with like ornamentation and this kind of flashiness. We're heading more towards something that's cooler and cleaner and more distinctly modern. So I think for a lot of us, when we think of Steuben glass, we think of crystal, right? We think of like a beautiful decanter like this or these wine goblets over here. And Steuben got to this solution in such a dramatic fashion. I think it was in 1933. They just do this radical transformation where they literally smashed everything in their inventory, melted it down, and started reformulating their work into this crystal that was informed by the research from Corning glassware. So now we have like a little bit of like Murano glass here in America, but it's all backed up by science. So it's a very conscious pivot away from color and iridescence and surface decoration. And now it becomes sort of like the staple. If somebody's getting married, you get them Steuben. If somebody's retiring, you get them Steuben. Even the White House had a collection of Steuben glass on display. And Steuben was very thoughtful in how they wanted to promote themselves to their audiences, sort of rarefied and elegant. The leaders of the company actually met with Henri Matisse, the French Fauves painter, who suggested a collaboration between avant-garde modern artists and Steuben Glassworks. And so they did just that. They partnered with Salvador Dali, and as we can see here, Georgia O'Keeffe, to have some of their signature works etched into Steuben plates. So it's a way to align yourself with what is current, what is sleek, and what is modern. So all of this is important to keep in mind as we shift gears and we enter into this studio glass movement, this revolution, because really the person who is at the very beginning of it is a man named Harvey Littleton, and he grew up in Corning, New York. His father was the head of R&D at Corning, and so everybody sort of expected him to become like a physicist or something. He went on to become a ceramics professor, but he's somebody who always felt in his heart that there was a potential for glass beyond the way it was used at Corning Glassworks. And in 1962, he held these now famous demonstrations in Toledo, Ohio, where he just immediately collapsed the distinction between designer and maker. And he started blowing glass and making these disruptive forms, essentially. But all of this is so very much informed by the fact that he was raised in this, he was steeped in it. So, what does it look like to collapse that division of labor that has been at the heart of art glass really since the beginning? This is what it looks like. Isn't this so amazing? He just started to abandon all of the structure, all of the expectation that came from the factories and the industry. This is called Amber Maze from 1968. And this is what freedom looks like in practice. There's no client to answer to, there's no commission here, there's certainly no industrial template that you have to follow. So we just have this organic drift to this shape. We have the sense of something that is caught in mid movement here. It is a world away from the perfection of a Steuben decanter, right? This work is at the Asheville Museum of Art. So this is the direction that Harvey Littleton goes in. Essentially, his glass becomes more like modern sculpture. He's claiming that space, that conceptual territory, really, for glass that any other artistic medium really had by this point. But it really isn't until the late 60s, the 1970s, that we see this happening. So this material that has really spent its history being in service of things, like we use it to display flowers or to hold wine, now it is worthy of museum gallery space on its own. There's one other important figure that helps move this revolution along. I should mention too that Harvey Littleton, he was really all about experimentation. And this figure here, a man from Murano, his name is Leo Pietra. He is the man who had been steeped not in like the science of Corning, but instead in those Venetian traditions. He started apprenticing in a glassblowing studio when he was just 11 years old. And so he brought to glassblowing this sophistication, these hundreds of years of wisdom that had been passed down in Murano. And so he's brought to America to start training other artists to hold these kind of open studio sessions in 1979. And he inspires so many other artists, including Dale Chihuly, who we'll see in just a moment. But I wanted to give you a sense in terms of what Lino's mastery sort of brings to the table here. He sort of pushed at the outer limits of what hot glass can physically do. These two vessels, which I think are from like the late 2018s, 2019s, they don't even look like they could stand upright on their own, right? They both have this feeling of like it's the very moment where the glass has cooled, and somehow they can stand upright. It almost feels like they're moving like laundry in the wind or fabric in the wind. And they have this beautiful color to them that again is really informed by that Venetian tradition here. So there's an elegance to this. There's certainly like an arabesque quality to a lot of his work. Here's one other installation here by Lino, and this is the Concerto de Primavera. It's a concert in spring, and we can see that together all of these vessels really do feel like they are in relation to each other, in concert with each other. There's a quality of performance here that actually almost speaks to what Lino did in terms of his studio workshops, because he was training so many other eager young artists who wanted to know the technical elements to the studio glass movement. And so he was doing these workshops right up until he was almost 90 years old. So we have a sense in terms of what he was capable of doing, the color, the form here. And it's probably not a surprise to learn that he and Dale Chihuly sort of had this meeting of the minds. This was in the late 1970s. So this is Dale Chihuly, who's watching him closely here. And then over on the right, actually drawing forms that then Lino would then bring into fruition using his furnace here. Chihuly called Lino Tagliapietra possibly the greatest glassblower, possibly the greatest living glassblower. So this is the man who really gets the ball rolling. He sets the stage for our rock star. And so now we're ready to really break some boundaries here. This is, of course, Dale Chihuly. He was born in 1941. He grew up in Tacoma, Washington, really far from any sort of glass blowing hub, certainly very far from Murano. But he, of course, is the most famous glass artist in the world today. And he kind of came to it by accident. He sort of discovered glass art in college. He did a Fulbright scholarship to Murano. He gets a taste of it really, and then he goes back to Washington State. He starts his own art school, and that's when Lino comes into the picture too. And now the Northwest is like this global center for glass art. So we know that Chihuly spends the next few decades really building this enormous body of work, building his reputation, and he has arrived at this place where he's doing things with glass that I don't think any other glass blower could have ever expected. He has made glass famous, essentially. He's just working with this incredible scale and ambition. And before we move on, really start taking a look at his work, just a quick note about the eye patch, because it's like something from a novel. If I told you I read it, you'd say it's too much to even believe. Apparently, Chihuly was in a car accident in 1976, and he went through the windshield, and it was shards of glass that blinded him. So now he sort of has stepped back from the role of producing the glass. He's more or less directing or choreographing the work in his studio. So now we've sort of reverted back to a division of labor in a really interesting way. All right, so let's sort of move through some of his forms very quickly here. And I should just say, Chihuly's work, I mean, his body of work is so extensive. He has work in hundreds of museums worldwide. He's been doing this for something like 60 years now. I mean, he really is at the top of his game, but we'll get to know this expansive body of work through some of his forms. He did a basket series starting in the late 1970s, inspired by indigenous basket weaving from the Northwest that he saw as a kid. And what you see glass doing here is essentially what woven baskets do. They sort of dip and they fold, and they don't quite stand up in a rigid way that you would expect glass to do, right? So he's borrowing that, and he's experimenting with the possibilities around it. I love these particular works because of their translucency too. The surface material and the translucency is beautiful. So there's something about the organic folds here that sort of morphs into his next form that he's so well known for. These are the C forms. These started in the 1980s, and we can see him pushing that same logic with the very thin walls here and that organic collapse in these works, making them a little bit more fluid, making them feel something like marine life too. So we have him mimicking these underwater forms with those delicate undulating shapes. And he oftentimes does do this very like strong outline on like the lips of the surfaces or the edges of these works. He did a 20 or 50-foot long installation at the Monterey Bay Aquarium back in 2002 of those sea forms. I mean, probably just the perfect setting for this, but it's kind of hard to believe it didn't just steal the show away from the marine life. Here's just a detail of that installation. Absolutely gorgeous. The next form that he became sort of fascinated by, or his next series, was the Macchia series. And the form is pretty familiar. It sort of seems like sea forms, but more like a vessel. The form doesn't really matter. He's exploring color here, and he comes to it in like a Chihuly fashion. He decides to see if he can use all 300 colors in his studio in one vessel. So he's experimenting with a difference between the inside and the outside of the vessel. He's keeping it very translucent. These vessels almost function like stained glass windows to a certain extent. You can kind of see through them. So great experiments in color here, again, sort of going back to that Murano tradition. And then you get his Persians, which are also from the 1980s. They just seem like flowers, right? But he has an interesting source for them. Yeah, he was interested in the very richly colored glassware from medieval Middle East. And he's taking that glassware and he's he's expanding it. He's turning it into those sea forms. He's turning it into flowers, but they tend to have these beautiful saturated jewel tones to them, so they feel a lot less like stemware than something organic. And he uses those Persians for so many of his installations. We have a whole ceiling over here, which is a museum in Toronto, the Royal Ontario Museum. We have this sort of speckled installation over here, which is at the Chihuly Garden and Glass in Seattle. Here is, I love this one. This is at a botanical garden in Pittsburgh. And then another Persian installation here. This one, much more spare, but I think just as effective. This is the Monarch window, which is at the Tacoma Union Station in Tacoma, Washington. So we can see he can do a number of things with these forms. He's still experimenting, though. He goes on to his Venetian series here, and this he's doing in concert with Lino, bringing in, again, that Italian influence. This is Chihuly at his most Baroque. It's sort of over the top, heavily ornamented. We can see like these leaves forms and these spirals here, these big exaggerated shapes. One critic described them as what happens when a vase has an affair with a chandelier. And I think that pretty much sums it up. He also did an Ikebana series, which was also done with Lino, but also influenced by Japanese flower arranging traditions. And so now it's really about these spare, sort of sinuous forms that are reaching out in these different directions. And again, having that exacting balance too, which Lino was particularly effective at orchestrating. So one last form for us to think about when it comes to Chihuly, there's so many of them, right, are the icicles. And this image on the left here is probably familiar to a lot of you. This is at the MFA in Boston, the lime green icicle tower from 2011. I think everybody feels like you just have to take a look at it before you leave the museum. So he uses these icicles that feel like these glass shards, right? They always feel a little bit dangerous to me. He can use them for an installation sort of in any form. And what we're looking at on the right is an installation that he did, a temporary installation for the Barney's window in New York City back in 2015. Here it is with some different lighting here. Very, very evocative, right? He also did a whole series of chandeliers. This one sort of feels like the icicles to me. Chandeliers suspended over the canals of Venice. This was back in 1996. This is like bringing hot glass home to Venice, right? But here he is doing something that nobody in Venice had ever dreamed of doing and certainly had never executed. So we see that his dreams, his ambitions here are so grandiose. And I think he really made a name for himself with enormous, exaggerated works like this one. This is in the entrance rotunda of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it's a chandelier. It's 27 feet long. It's 12 feet across, and it's composed of 1,300 individual glass blown elements here. It feels like a party, doesn't it? Here's another view of it illuminated by that table underneath. And it really like sets the tone for a space. You feel like you've arrived and you feel like something extraordinary and beautiful awaits you. So he uses this chandelier form pretty consistently, but we can also see here he can add different colors to it. This particular one is also in Tacoma. I recently saw this iteration of his work. This was at the Biltmore in Asheville, and in their winery in particular, which is a perfect setting for it. I think they commissioned it specifically to have the reds and the whites in there to reference all the wine as well. So again, there is this electric sort of effusive energy to this, and it feels so special. And I have to say, librarians are just the best, because I also came across this image that was created by a school librarian who created their own Chihuly inspired sculpture for the children's room at their library. So we could all have, in theory, our own Chihuly at home. Chihuly's fame and his reputation in some ways was really built off of this extraordinary installation that he did in 1999. This is called Um, well, this was in Jerusalem, and it was an installation that was at the Tower of David Museum. So these are like the old city walls. This is like 3,000 years of history here. This is such a contested space in terms of the religions of the world, too. And so here's Chihuly bringing in all of this color, and in this medium that again it seems so fragile, and it attracted so many people. I think it still holds a record for being one of the most visited temporary exhibitions ever. More than 1 million people went to go see it. Here's Chihuly himself standing alongside this cobalt blue tower that was a part of that installation. The tower itself is like 48 feet tall. This pink mountain over here was something like 40 feet tall. So all of this really attracted all of this attention. And then there was, I think, another important and evocative element to that particular show. Chihuly brought in, I think it was 64 tons of Alaskan ice. And he placed it there in Jerusalem alongside his work. So we're thinking two very fragile materials, right? Ice and glass here. And in this case, the ice was meant to visually represent all of this religious tension that's present, especially in that part of the world, and that it would slowly melt over time. It was also illuminated by light in the night, colorful lights at night, and people sort of seeing through that glass wall and seeing it sort of, or this ice wall, seeing it dissolve over time. I think was really meaningful to a lot of people. So we're going to wrap up, sort of thinking about Chihuly, this incredible reputation that he has, and I think this enduring interest and love on the part of the public. We're looking at his installation at the Bellagio Hotel in Las Vegas. This was completed in 1998. It's one of his biggest works of art. In fact, it holds the record, I think, for largest glass sculpture in the world. You'll never believe where the idea for this came from. Apparently, Chihuly has some of these flower-like elements at the bottom of his pool at his own house. And the casino owner was there with his wife and said, I want something like at the bottom of your pool on the ceiling of my lobby. And now millions of people come through this space to see this, again, this really joyful display. It's over 2,000 flowers here that I love are sort of like spilling out from the edges of what is roughly a 2,000 square foot space here. So like I said, it holds the record. It speaks to his amazing capacity to push the boundaries of this medium. And again, to really just make it famous. He's left quite a mark. And if you're still sitting there thinking, I want to see that pool, there it is. So we're going to wrap up tonight right on time with a quick peek at what a few other glass artists are doing, the different directions they're taking it into. We're going to start off with Dan Dailey. And Dan Dailey was actually Dale Chihuly's first graduate student. This was at the Rhode Island School of Design. And he's taking glass in his own direction, really making it his own. He is much more interested in storytelling and figurative art. He is based out of New Hampshire as well. He had a really nice retrospective at the Courier, I think just a year or so ago. So we can see in some of his earliest work, Dan Dailey's earliest work, that even though he's working with like traditional forms of a vessel, he is literally applying a face to it. He's making it a character. There's a little bit of quiet comedy that's happening here too. And he's thinking about personality. I mean, he's thinking about how to breathe life into glass here. This is called the Matron. This is also at the Corning Glassworks. And within the space of a few years, he starts this series that's called the Individuals series. And he's moving away from vessels entirely at this point. Now we have freestanding figurative sculptures, and they feel like part portrait, part caricature, part Art Deco flair, right? There's just this wonderful craftsman precision here, but then you also have a little bit of wit. There's just so much character, I think, in this figure over here with the hair being blown back. Here are two other figures from that individual series. I absolutely love the guy who's just sort of folded over in half like this. It might be because I have an 11-year-old son, and this is the mode that 11-year-olds are in. So from there, Dailey goes on and he starts working with a new medium, vitriolite, these sculptures that are glass, but they're now he's expressing it through like these flatter forms that almost feel more like drawings in some ways. He makes all of these characters that are just so endearing, doing such familiar things, and it really does feel like he's drawing with glass at this point. But it seems like whatever he makes, he works with a lot of metals as well. He's always thinking about humanizing his forms. So I just love these wall sconces over here, male and female, and they are holding these rings in their hand that you would then pull to turn on the lights. This is a work that was acquired by the Courier in my hometown, this kind of leaping figure whose entire head is the light bulb. It speaks to imagination and great ideas, doesn't it? One last work from Dan Dailey that I wanted to share with you was a private commission from just a couple of years ago, and it's called The Bar Scene. It's 10 feet long. It is a sculpture. It's a light. Imagine this hanging over your kitchen counter, over your island, right? It We see all of these figures portrayed from the waist up, and some of them are interacting, and some of them are just kind of thoughtful. It feels like we are at like a great little after work spot here where everybody's unwinding. It's like the cast of Cheers hanging out with you above your kitchen island here. Who could ask for anything more? So, over the past 50 years, we've seen Dan Dailey producing works like this, works that can be funny and figurative and deeply human. And he shows that the decorative arts, at their best, can be as serious as any other form of art. We're just going to end with a quick peek at the work of Josh Simpson. He came to the glass movement in the 1970s, and he's been rooted in this kind of single obsessive subject ever since, and that is the cosmos. How perfect for like the day after the launch of Artemis, too, right? These are his mega planets, and they are these beautiful, dense, luminous spheres. They are, of course, a descendant of those 19th century paperweights that we saw before, but now they have an individual maker, somebody who's like dedicated to doing this. And the fact that the artist's wife, Josh Simpson's wife, is named Katie Coleman, and she's an actual NASA astronaut who has carried his sculptures into orbit with her, feels like an important element of understanding his work and probably why he is so concerned with this particular subject. So we are at the end of our time. We're just going to conclude very quickly here with one last nice comparison between Tiffany and Chihuly. Over the past 130 years, glass has been shaped by an extraordinary range of people: factory workers, independent artists, designers, dreamers, women whose names we're only now just learning about, some we'll never learn about. And each one of them was pushing this medium somewhere new. And what they all share across all that time and difference is a devotion to a material that never stops surprising us, never stops leaving us in awe. And that is what makes all of them masters of glass. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time and attention, everybody. Wasn't this, aren't these images just extraordinary? I welcome any of your thoughts, questions, ideas.
So Jane, we have some questions in the Q&A. The first is from Marcia, and it's related to the image that you have up, actually. How do you
Yeah.
feel about the wood frame for the Tiffany stained glass? It feels like the wood
Oh,
takes away from the delicacy of the glass.
Marcia, that's such a good question. And I think that I'm thinking of the autumn landscape here too. It does feel particularly heavy when I look at this one, and it does feel like a distraction, but that might just be a matter of taste. It doesn't seem like he often used such heavy wood for the framings too. Oh, Marcia asked, where's the Maxwell Parish work located? That's in Philadelphia. It was commissioned by the Curtis Publishing Company, which I don't know if that exists anymore, but the lobby of the building still exists. You can go and see the Maxfield Parish for free. And get this, it's right across the street from Independence Hall in Philadelphia. So the next time you're in Philadelphia, you know where you need to stop. Oh,
Okay, we
we've
have
got a good question here. It's more of a technical question. Where did glassmakers get their sand from? That I don't know the right answer for that one. There's a whole formula, a whole mix of things that you need to for like optimal conditions for glass blowing. And there might be somebody with us tonight who's had some experience with this, but I'm not exactly sure where they get their sand from or where they've gotten it from historically. But it seems like Murano was probably a good place to source a lot of it. Thank you for that question. I'm sorry I don't have the technical answer. Jeff says, is the color in the stained glass throughout the glass or only on the surface? That's a good question. I think in some cases, some color can be sort of like painted on. Some of it's exposed to chemicals. It goes all the way through. So you have that translucency. So when we were looking at like Saint Chapelle. I mean, that's translucent glass. Some of this, there's like an opalescence to it. I would describe it as, and so it is probably not as translucent as say like the stained glass in I don't know. I was going to say Saint Chapelle, but that wasn't totally translucent either. So so I think that well, without knowing, I think that there was a certain effect that was created with chemicals. I'm not sure if it happened on both sides, but I think that's how we get what seems like a painted sky back here. But that's a good question, Jeff. I'm not sure if it goes all the way through. He also asks, how does check glass rank in comparison to those you've highlighted? I am doing a real surface level overview. We haven't gone too deep. And for myself, I'm not as familiar with those traditions. That's not to say that it's not significant. So now I'll probably go down the rabbit hole of Czech glass art later on tonight. Thanks for your question, Jeff. I'm sorry I don't have good answers for you. Oh, Barbara Robidoux, thanks for being here tonight. Um, uh, Thanks for your kind words too. Oh, and you too, Marcia. I really appreciate it. Oh, I'm glad this felt like it was easy to understand. That's always what I'm aiming for, and always that sense of art too. Oh, Anna also added where to go to see art glass. You know what? I added a couple of slides for that too. If anybody's dying to know where to go, here are some museums with significant art glass collections. Obviously, Corning, the Chihuly Garden, if you want to get on a plane, the Toledo Museum of Art. This summer, next month, the Corning Museum of Glass is going to do an exhibition on women in the American studio glass movement. That should be really interesting. And then I like to remind people too that there's people, our friends and neighbors are also making hot glass. And so here in New Hampshire, where I'm located, you can even go to places like the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen's annual Craftsman's Fair and see glass that was made, meet the makers too. You have Alex Kalish here and Jordana Corson, who runs workshops at Corning Glassware. So we've like, very sophisticated examples of glass making really in our own backyard.
Jane, can I throw in the Portland Museum of Art in Maine has a nice
Yeah.
collection of glass downstairs.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Wherever you've seen, I've got a list of some smaller, well, not smaller, but other places too. I mean, the Chihuly and Toledo really stand out, but places like the Chrysler, the MFA, the Smithsonian, the Met, I mean, all of these museums would have pretty significant glass. I mean, even the Courier in Manchester has some pretty significant examples of glass history there. Oh, Marcia, you got to go to Seattle and see the Chihuly. Okay, well, you're like living everybody's dream right now. I think everybody wants more Chihuly in their life at this moment.
Jane, there's one more question from Jeff asking if you've tried to blow glass yourself.
Oh, no, I haven't. I've been to a couple of demonstrations in different places. I saw glass blowing in Venice when I was too young to really appreciate what I was looking at. So I've seen it happen before. I have friends that do glass blowing and they describe the challenges of it to me. I feel like I have just such a very rudimentary understanding, but a great big appreciation for it. It seems so incredibly difficult to me. And we've looked at just these stunning examples tonight, and the effort that goes into making them is just so like beyond what I can even imagine in some cases. So yeah, for those of you that are familiar with how it's made, I think you can see these works in a whole new light. Yeah.
All right, any other questions? Well, I think that that's a wrap, Jane.
All right. All right. Well,
Thank
thank you,
you.
everybody.
Yes, thank you so much. And you'll be back here on May 11th to talk about the Peel family. Um, they're a fascinating family and early American history, which is always fun. I will put a link to the registration in the follow-up email, and I'll
Mhm.
get this recording out to people probably tomorrow.
Awesome.
So we look forward to seeing you in May, Jane, and good night, everybody.
Good night. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
Bye.